Chmyadzin in Soviet Armenia. If, as he steadfastly maintained, all his money came from God, he certainly had a lot to be grateful for. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Calouste Gulbenkian was 70. Although a British subject, he had also been for many years honorary commercial counsellor at the Persian embassy in Paris. He had therefore intended to remain there for the duration. But after the fall of France in 1940, anxious to preserve his diplomatic status, he followed the embassy to Vichy, the temporary capital of unoccupied France. But he didn't stay there for long, and in 1942 he decided to move to neutral Portugal. Nevat chose a hotel in the seaside town of Estoril and ultimately returned to Paris. Nubar remained in England. But Calouste settled firmly in Lisbon. He was to remain there for the rest of his life. He never bought a house there. He had had enough of houses. The Avenue d'Iéna, he complained, had given him nothing but trouble. And so he took over the first floor of the small but immensely luxurious Hotel Avise. It was his last home. But Portugal didn't mean retirement. Far from it. During the 13 years that he spent here, from 1942 to 1955 when he died, Calouste Gulbenkian pulled off one of the greatest coups of his entire career. It happened in 1948 when, after a long, hard struggle, he finally persuaded the American oil companies to develop production in Iraq in return for his giving them a free hand in Saudi Arabia. The result of this agreement was that by the time he died, Iraq was the 6th greatest oil-producing country in the world. And Gulbenkian was receiving, from this source alone, the equivalent of some 30 to 40 million pounds a year. But even after that triumph, he went on working. Often on sunny days, he would go off into the public gardens with his faithful secretary and dictate letters to her from a park bench while he watched the birds, or, in particular, admired the sunsets. Because he had a passion for sunsets and could hardly be dragged away from them till the very last light had faded. In his diary, he wrote about them as if they were works of art.
The sunset was fantastically beautiful. It was not a blaze of sparkling, blinding, dazzling light, but was made up of symphonies of red and gold, strangely delicate. Among the sunsets I remember having seen in both the east and the west, this one will remain as the most beautiful memory for the infinite delicacy of the harmony of the colors.
And indeed, his collection was always uppermost in his thoughts. He would return to the hotel every night for dinner, alone or in the company of visiting members of his family, business associates, or occasionally some great art dealer. For he continued, as always, to collect. His hotel suite, of course, was too small to accommodate large pictures or furniture, so by now he was concentrating on smaller items, additions very often to his already superb Oriental collections. And yet, buy as he might, there always remained in the back of his mind the same anxiety. His children. What was to be done with them? Apart from the gold coins which he'd brought with him to Portugal, he hadn't seen them since the war. Since then, many of the most important pictures had been away on loan, first to the National Gallery in London and then to its counterpart in Washington, D.C. And at various moments, he'd actually considered giving the whole of his collection to one or the other of those institutions. The trouble was that neither of them would accept his one firm condition, that all the pieces that he'd so painstakingly brought together should remain together, so that people could see what one man could achieve in his lifetime. And so there gradually took shape in his mind the idea of a great charitable foundation that would have the care of his collections, his children as he still liked to call them, to safeguard their future, and at the same time be used for other charitable, educational, artistic, and scientific purposes. He discussed the idea with his closest Portuguese associate, Dr. José Perdigão, who was his legal advisor and had been ever since his first arrival in the country. And it was Dr. Perdigão who first persuaded him that the foundation, while operating also in England and indeed for Armenian causes everywhere, should have its base in Portugal and indeed operate here from Lisbon. The result was this magnificent foundation, this wonderful cultural center that we see here today, which is a far more moving and magnificent tribute to the memory of Calouste Gulbenkian than he could ever have imagined. And so it has come about. The Gulbenkian Foundation has a branch in Portland Place in London and runs a Portuguese cultural centre at the old Gulbenkian house on the Avenue d'Iéna. Here in Portugal, apart from its charitable activities, it runs its own ballet company, orchestra, choir, scientific research centre and rural library services. It organises concerts and lectures, exhibitions and plays and films, cultural manifestations, in short, of every conceivable kind. And it caters for the cultural needs of Armenian communities all over the world. Thanks to Dr. Perdigão, there's even a museum of modern art, specialising in Portuguese works, but gradually building up an interesting collection of paintings by British and Armenian artists. And so the 20th century now complements the older works in Gulbenkian's own museum a couple of 100 yards away. But of all these activities and amenities, the collection forms the central focus, the nucleus around which all the rest is gathered. The irony is that Gulbenkian never saw it in its permanent home. He died in his Lisbon hotel on the 20th of July 1955, aged 86. And this museum opened its doors 14 years later, in October 1969. There's only one picture of him on public display in the building. But then, dictatorial and domineering as he was, he remained a modest man. He loathed publicity, never gave interviews, seldom even allowed himself to be photographed. He was offered both the French Legion of Honor and a British knighthood, but both of them he declined. They were not, as he put it, his cup of tea. Only one decoration did he ever accept, the Portuguese Cordon of Christ. Visitors to the museum today are given only one small insight into the character of the man whose genius made it possible. An inscription on the wall of the entrance hall. Translated, it reads, "I am fully conscious that the time has come to take a decision on the future of my works of art. I can say, without risk of exaggeration, that I consider them as my children, and that their welfare is one of my overriding preoccupations. They represent 50 or 60 years of my life, during which I brought them together, often with innumerable difficulties, but always and exclusively guided by my own personal taste. Of course, like all collectors, I took advice, but I feel them to be mine, in heart and soul."